Hi and welcome to this video on matching. This will be one of the most important videos that you'll watch when it comes to advanced exposure blending. So I'm sure when you've tried to exposure blend in the past, you've found that as you've blended the images, they haven't looked natural. Usually they would have lost a little bit of contrast. Now I'm going to show you my favorite technique for overcoming that problem. And as I mentioned, that's something that I call matching. I'm also going to show you how to very quickly prepare your images in Adobe Camera Raw. Usually I do very little in Adobe Camera Raw. I open them up, I select both of them, so I've got two exposures here. I've got a base exposure and a darker exposure which covers the sky. And then I select them both, I go to this tab here and click on Remove Chromatic Aberration and usually Enable Profile Corrections. Then I often change the temperature or tint slider to get a more natural look. So I think this is a little bit too warm, so I'm going to bring this slider along and also bring along some of the tint. Now I don't want it to be too cold, I want to keep some mood, so let's make it a little bit warmer and a tiny bit more tint there. Now with that done, instead of pressing Open Images down the bottom here, I'm going to hold down Shift and choose Open Objects, and that way we open both of our images as smart objects. And with my images in Photoshop, I simply press Stack on the Raya Pro Hub. I press Command and 0 or Control and 0 to make the image full size. And now let's look at our images. Here we have an exposure, which is my base exposure, which has all the information I need in the foreground. And my darker exposure has all the information I need in the sky. Blending these two exposures in terms of making a good selection won't be difficult because we have a really white sky. So this is the area we want to select. And it's very white compared to the foreground, which is quite dark. So we can open up Instamask and let's say try a Brights 1. And you see that's already given us a good selection of the sky. But just for good practice, let's open up the RGB masks and see what they look like instead. So we've got the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. Now I don't think those give us any better of a selection than the standard luminosity masks in Instamask. So let's go for a Brights 1 and I'm going to close the RGB masks. Now let's try Brights 2 to see if that gives us a slightly more contrasting selection, and it does. Maybe a little bit too contrasting actually. We don't want the foreground to be black, we want it to be a dark grey. So if I choose my Brights 1 mask and I bring along the slider, you see we make the sky even whiter and also at the same time darken the foreground. Now if I'm happy with that selection, I can follow the same steps I've followed previously. I can press Select, Black Mask, Hide Marching Ants, Show the Layer, make sure I have a white brush selected. Let's make it a large brush, and then I can close Instamask, and with opacity at 100, flow at 100, and smoothing at 100, I just paint in the sky there. Now, that's done a reasonably good job in the sense that it's brought through the sky and it hasn't affected too much of the foreground. But you might see a little bit of a problem here. I'm going to open up Instamask and just press Deselect. Then I'm going to press Z on my keyboard so I can zoom in. Look at these mountains along here. We've got some strange, brighter mountains which don't look very natural. And we've got some more along here. If I zoom out a little bit, see it looks a little bit surreal. And if I disable the mask, that's what the mountains should look like. They should be a little bit darker. But here, they're brighter and they don't look particularly natural. The same can be said for some areas along here too. You see, the blend doesn't look as clean as it could look. Now, the reason for that is if we disable the mask, it's because the darker exposure is too dark in comparison to the brighter exposure. So when those two exposures meet in those areas, so the transition areas, they generally cancel each other out and the contrast is killed in those areas. Now this is just a subtle example of how contrast can be killed when exposure blending, and I'm going to show you some more extreme examples after this. But if you ever see this type of thing through your blending, all you need to do is open up Instamask. Select your dark exposure and press this thing called ACR. You can do the same thing by double clicking on the thumbnail here. But if I press ACR, you'll see Adobe Camera Raw opens up again. Now by matching, I mean we're going to bring up the values of the darker exposure to roughly match that of the base exposure. Now because the difference here was only subtle, we only lost a little bit of contrast in some areas, we don't have to match these exposures too much. Watch what happens if I bring up my exposure roughly one stop, and then I bring down the highlights because we don't want to overexpose the highlights. And then possibly bring up the shadows slightly. And you see we're brightening the areas that had a poor transition previously. So I'm just brightening those up, but I'm not losing information in the sky, so I can bring down the highlights. Now of course that's going to create extra noise in the foreground or the shadowy areas. However, we're not going to be using the shadowy areas or the dark areas from the dark exposure, so it doesn't matter. The sky has the same amount of noise as it had when we first started, because that's the information that the dark exposure holds. So if I just press OK, you'll see that the horizon here became much more natural, this area. It doesn't have such a strange look to it. It looks like it really does belong in the background. Now we can make this even more natural if we double click on the base exposure and we bring down the highlights in the base exposure. Again, even though this is going to create some sort of degradation in the sky, we're not going to be using the sky in the final image from the base exposure. We're just going to be using the foreground, so it doesn't matter if there's any degradation in the sky. Do you see how we darkened the mountains there and it became much more natural? So there's before and there's after. Now you might be wondering what these lines are along here. Well, if I disable this layer, you see we actually do have some fog, some low-lying mist here, which is quite bright. So if I make the darker exposure visible again, we just continue that fog. So that's not a problem with the blending, that's just a natural foggy element in the scene. So again, that's before and after. But now we've created a much more natural blend on the horizon and along here too. See, those mountains look like they belong there, whereas previously they looked kind of stuck on and false. Now that's just a very subtle example of matching. And here's the before and after, by the way. You see we've got a lovely blend there where we've pulled back all the highlights in the sky. Now I'm going to show you a more extreme example of matching where you can really see the difference that it makes. So in this example we have the famous Antelope Canyons, and there's a huge difference in light between these two exposures. So blending this scene is famously difficult, which is why so many experienced photographers go back to HDR software just to blend exposures from Antelope Canyon. But I'm going to show you how we don't need to do that. But first, let me select these two exposures. So we've got a really dark exposure and a brighter exposure. I'm going to select them and open up the Lens Corrections tab. Choose Remove Chromatic Aberration and Enable Profile Corrections. Now the foreground here is a little bit too bright, so I'm going to select that and I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit. We want more mood in our image, and to do that it's often best to darken the foreground slightly or darken the whole image slightly. And now I'm going to bring up the shadows a tiny bit just so we don't have any underexposed areas. Then I'm going to select both exposures. Hold down Shift just as before and choose Open Objects. Then I'm going to choose Stack, and this will stack our exposures, make them nice and big, and make our dark exposure invisible. Now to blend these exposures we need a relatively contrasting mask. So I'm going to go for a Brights 1 first just to see what we've got here, and then a Brights 2. And I think that's pretty good. It gives us a good selection of this sky and excludes much of the foreground. What happens if I bring this slider along a little bit just to make more of this area white? And maybe bring the midtones up a tiny bit. And I think that'll just about do it. So now I press Select, Black Mask, hide the marching ants, show the layer, choose a white paintbrush and just start painting in those areas. So we're bringing back the sky and some of the rocks that are at the top there. And I press Deselect to deselect that active selection. Now here's the before and after. So you can see what I mentioned previously about flattening contrast. So again, that's because there are too many stops of light between these two exposures. So they don't sit on top of each other naturally. If we look at this area here on the rock, and then we make the mask visible, that area comes through from the darker exposure and flattens the contrast in that area in the brighter exposure. So, as I mentioned, this is a more extreme version of matching, so we just need to open up Instamask again and press ACR, and here's Adobe Camera Raw. And so now we want to match the brightness values of that base exposure, just as we did last time, but in a much more extreme way. So let's bring up the shadows quite significantly, and bring down the highlights. We always must remember that we're trying to control the highlights here. We don't want them to be overexposed. So I'm going to bring up the shadows a little bit more. And again, if we look at the foreground, look how much noise we're generating here. It's incredible. But we're not going to be using that area in the final image. We're just going to be using the sky, which has zero noise, and these areas here, which also have no noise in them. So it isn't really going to make any difference. Now, we've roughly matched the brightness level of the base exposure. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect. We can brighten it up if we want, but it doesn't have to be the exact same brightness. And now we can press OK. Now, do you see how quickly and naturally those exposures started to blend with each other? Previously, we had this horrible contrast here, and now we have a much more natural transition between those two exposures. But it's still not completely natural. So just as we did in the last photo, I'm going to press ACR, and I'm going to bring down the highlights of this base exposure. I don't want to bring it down too much here. I still want to retain some of the nice brightness and the wavy parts of this foreground here. And when I'm done, I can press OK. And so let's zoom in to this transition area again. And so before I brought down the highlights in the base exposure, that's what this area looked like. You see, it's lacking in contrast still, even after matching the bright exposure. But when I brought down the highlights of the base exposure, we got that beautiful detail back. And look, in the foreground, we have no added noise. So if I disable the mask on the darker exposure, look how much noise we've got in the foreground. But because we're not using that area in the final image, it doesn't affect our photo. We don't have added noise. And if there's any blending issues at all still when you've done that, we can always bring down the opacity of this darker exposure. So there's the before and after. And I should note, we don't have to be that extreme when matching our images. Even with this image, we could probably do it less harshly. So I could probably bring the shadows down a little bit more and possibly push up the highlights a little bit more. And so when I press OK, you see we still have quite a natural blend. So if you find that any of your transition areas have a little bit of noise in them, which doesn't really matter because we're zoomed in, let's say, at 234% here, so no one's going to see any real noise. But if you do find that that happens, why not just lessen some of that matching effect until you're happy? So I could possibly even bring down my exposure a little bit. And that means I can bring up my highlights a little bit more and press OK. So you see we're still coming out with quite a natural blend, even at 100% opacity for this layer. And all we've done is matched a little bit. So we don't actually have to match our exposures exactly to make a really natural blend. So if I zoom in 100%, you see we have no added noise anywhere in the image. And now with these exposures blended, you can start dodging and burning. Let me show you how I like to dodge and burn. So if I open up the dodge and burn panel, I like to go for my midtones straight away, so I don't affect any of the highlights. And then I make a relatively contrasting mask. I'm trying to select just the midtones here, not the shadows or the highlights. And then once I've done that, I can press OK. Now I can choose a white paintbrush, make it a little bit smaller than that, and start painting in those midtones. Now if I want to strengthen that effect and maybe add a little bit of color, I can change this layer to overlay and bring the opacity down significantly. And you see we keep that nice creamy color. And then I can do the same along here and anywhere else really in our image, because we're not going to affect the highlights or the shadows. We're just affecting the midtones. So I can go over these a couple of times. And so here is the before and after. Look how we're bringing some beautiful brightness to those mid-tone areas without affecting the shadows or the highlights. And if you want, you can do the same with the shadows. I could create a shadows layer, and this is selecting the shadows and the mid-tones. So I can bring along this black slider, and this is going to narrow our selection down to just our shadows. I can bring the highlight slider up. See, we've got a really good selection now of our shadows, and press OK. Now I can choose a black brush, and I only want probably a low opacity of about 20%. Let's see if that looks any good. Yeah, so we're just burning the shadows now. And by doing that, we're increasing the beautiful detail in the image. And we're making it almost a 3D image, as if you could touch the textures throughout the scene. And so here's a comparison so you can see before the dodging and burning and after. There's before and after. And if you find that the effect's a little bit strong, we can just bring down the opacity of that layer. And the great thing is, because these are on empty layers with masks, they are entirely non-destructive. So I hope you see how important it is to match your exposures when you're struggling with a blend. So if you ever want to remember a simple rule for matching, it's this. In your base exposure, bring your highlights down significantly. And in your darker exposure, just brighten up your exposure even a little bit, while at the same time controlling your highlights. And there you'll create a very natural blend. So I'm going to show you a couple more examples of this. So in our third example, we have a bathroom here. And just as before, I like to open up lens corrections, remove chromatic aberration, and enable profile corrections. And then I go back to the main tab, and if I want to adjust any colors or anything like that, I could do that there, but I think this is okay. I think it looks quite natural. So I select both of these exposures, then I hold down Shift and I choose Open Objects. With these exposures open, I press Stack, and as always, I have my base exposure on bottom and my dark exposure on top, and I make that invisible. Now, I want to make a selection mainly of the window here, but it's probably also going to affect the bathtub and everything else that's quite bright. So let's see if we can get a relatively contrasting selection that limits itself just to really the highlights. Let's try a Brights 2. I think a Bright 2 is actually a pretty good selection. We've got some of the curtains here in the foreground are visible, so we can make those a little bit whiter with the highlight slider. But overall, I think that's quite a good contrasting mask. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. So as always, I press Select. I hide the marching ants, I create a black mask, I show the layer, I choose my white brush, and that's a good size actually, with a brush opacity of 100%, flow at 100% and smoothing at 100%, and I just paint in this window. So we're not going to affect the toilet or the bathtub. We're just painting in the window, so it's a very selective mask. Then I press Deselect. Now, as you can see, just as before, that's a terrible blend. It doesn't look natural. The window's gone dark and flattened the contrast. And again, that's because our dark exposure is really dark. So we're taking areas like this side of the window and the windowsill, and we're putting it into here. And as you can see, it's just going to flatten the contrast. Those two exposures just don't go together nicely. But if we open up Adobe Camera Raw, just as before, we bring our exposure up and let's say our shadows up while bringing our highlights down, we start to imitate the brightness values of the base exposure. So I've got my exposure 1.9, my shadows at +40, and my highlights at 61. And then I press OK. Watch the blend. You see how natural it becomes? That's before and after, before and after. But I still don't think it's incredibly natural. I think it can be better. So I'm going to open up Adobe Camera Raw on the base exposure. And you've guessed it, I'm going to bring down the highlights. And that's all the information I can get from the highlights and that exposure. So I'm going to press OK. And there you see we've made a more natural blend in the sense that we've darkened the window. So look at how flat the contrast is along here. and after, before and after. And that is exactly how the image should look. Look at the plant here. It's too light and there's not enough contrast, and that's after bringing down the highlights. Now, if you still feel that the window's a little bit bright, we've got two options. Again, we can bring down the opacity, and I think that's probably a pretty good solution here because we need it to be nice and bright. Or we can simply open up a curves layer, press this button here to create a clipping mask. Watch, if I just bring up the brightness of that exposure, it makes the scene more natural. So let me show you the original exposure before we did any blending. So I'm going to choose New Smart Object via Copy. I'm going to put this at the bottom and call it Original. I'm going to open up Adobe Camera Raw so we can double click on there to do that. Press Default and press OK. So this is after we blended the exposures, and that's before, after, and before. Now let me show you that as an apply image instead of luminosity masks. I'm going to delete that layer and delete the mask on the dark exposure. We don't need to do any of the matching again because we've already done that. And this time make the brighter exposure invisible because remember we brought down the highlights in the brighter exposure, so we've got more information in the window. If I press Brights 2 again, we're going to come out with too much information in the window. So this is our original base exposure if you remember. So now if I press Brights 2 and bring along the highlights just as we did before, maybe some of the midtones, I can select the darker exposure and just press Apply. And there we have it. This time I've applied the mask to the entire image, but because we've matched, it looks relatively natural. So again, that's an important example showing you how powerful matching is when it comes to achieving a natural blending effect. Now I've got two more examples to show you how useful matching is. So here we've got two exposures from Petra in Jordan, a very beautiful place. And I'm going to go to my lens corrections, choose remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Then I'm going to actually bring the temperature along a little bit because it's probably a little bit too warm. Now we have a base exposure on top and we have a darker exposure on the bottom. And this darker exposure has all the information in these beautiful lanterns. And of course, those lanterns are overexposed in the base exposure. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is because the process works exactly the same as the other examples. So I'm going to do exactly the same, but these two images aren't aligned. The tripod must have moved in the sand when I was shooting them. So if we just zoom into one of these candles and show you the comparison, there's some slight movement there, which is kind of hard to see right now between these lanterns. So you see that's the top of the lantern there. So if I bring down my rulers, there's the top of the lantern there in the darker exposure, and there's the top of the lantern there in the brighter exposure. So I need to align these layers, and the problem is they're smart objects. You can't align smart objects in Photoshop, it just won't let you. Now there are two ways we can get around that. One way I'm going to show you here, which is manually aligning, and the second way I'm going to show you later on, which is where it's not possible to manually align. So first of all, let's put the base exposure on the bottom, and we've got the dark exposure on top. Then with the dark layer selected, we change this blend mode to difference, which we've already seen earlier on in the tutorial. I'm going to zoom into some of these lanterns, let's say these ones here. Click on the Move tool in the top left-hand corner, click once on the image, and I'm going to use my arrow keys, push them up to align these layers. You see, we don't have any more thick white edging around those two exposures. So if I press the left arrow key, you see this line starts to appear, showing you where the mismatch is between the two exposures. So I'm going to bring that along again, and now they're matched. So if I change that to normal, there's the before and after. They're nicely lined up. So let's get to exposure blending. I'm going to open up Instamask, choose, let's say, a Brights 2 or a Brights 3. We need a really contrasting mask that's only going to affect the highlights. And once we've done that, and I think Brights 3 is actually a pretty good selection. Brights 4 would probably work, but we don't want it too restrictive. So I'm going to go for Brights 3, choose my dark exposure, press Apply, make the dark exposure visible. And of course, as you can see, it doesn't look very natural. All the rocks around there have lost their contrast. Now the best way to do it with this image, in my opinion, is just to bring down the opacity of the dark exposure, because we don't need all of that information from the lamps. Just some information like that would do the job. We can see some of the beautiful texture in the paper. But instead, why don't we match and see how that works? So I'm going to bring the opacity up to 100%. I'm going to open Instamask and choose Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to bring up the exposure quite a lot, bring down the highlights just a little bit, because as I said, it's okay if we have the highlights a little bit bright in these lamps, because we don't need all that information there. And then I can press OK. Now I don't know if we need to bring down the brightness of this exposure, but let's give it a try and see what happens. We might affect the building too much. So if I bring down the highlights, no, the buildings aren't too badly affected. It might do a decent job. So that's before we brought down highlights, and that's after. And the real benefit here is through the textures in the rocks. But I think we've brought down the highlights too much in this exposure. We still want them to be nice and bright. So let's do that again. I'm going to bring down the highlights, this time to about 53, let's say. Yeah, and that's a bit better. We still have some nice bright areas around here. We've brought back information in the lamp, and the blend looks very natural. So there is before and after. And I think that's a big improvement. So now I have one more example to show you, and this is with 3 exposures. So you're going to see how we can match a brighter exposure into a base exposure as well. And it's going to be using an interior example. Now we have 3 exposures. We have this base exposure, a brighter exposure for the darker areas, just to brighten the room up generally, and a darker exposure. Notice I didn't go for a dark exposure where the window is perfectly visible and dark. I went for a dark exposure which is still relatively bright. We've got enough information in the exterior, but the foreground isn't too dark. So we talked about that earlier when we discussed which exposures you should use for exposure blending. Now, just as before, we're going to select all of our exposures. We're going to remove chromatic aberration, enable profile corrections. And now I don't want to do anything in here right now. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and open objects. With our 3 images open, I can just press stack. And then I put my base exposure at the bottom. I've got my dark exposure in the middle and the bright exposure on top. I make all of these exposures invisible, and I choose the dark exposure. Now I want to make a selection of the window without selecting much of the foreground. Brights 1 does a reasonably good job. Let's see what we can get from the RGB masks. If I click on the red channel, not great. The green channel, well, that's a bit of a better selection. You see, I'm looking at the window here to see how much of the window we can get white. And that's a little bit better. And yeah, I think blue gives us the best selection because it gives us a relatively dark foreground and more of the window. So let's compare that with the brights 1 on the normal mask. Actually, I don't think there's a big difference there. There is a little bit of a difference, so let's go for blue channel bright 1. So I close that, and I'm going to bring along the highlight slider again just to remove that window from the selection. We don't want any of the exterior to be visible in the mask. We want it all white. And of course we want a contrasting mask as well, because we don't want too much of this ceiling to be affected. Then we press Select, Black Mask, Show Layer, Hide Marching Ants, and a white brush, and we're just going to paint in the exterior from the dark exposure. And that looks quite natural. Notice, however, how we're affecting the arms on the sofa here. We'll zoom into that in a second and I can show you. But let me just paint in the window here and the reflection there too. And by the way, you might have noticed, unfortunately, my camera is visible in this scene. I mean, it's fairly easy to clone out, but I shot this image just for this video. It's not for any clients or anything like that. So apologies for my unprofessionalism. So the blend here looks pretty good. Now just make sure you've deselected any active selection, and let's zoom in to the image. The arms on the sofa look very dark, probably too dark, especially along this side here and on this side here too. The windows themselves don't look too bad, but I think they look a little bit too dark as well. So I think we need to brighten those up to make them look a little bit more natural. So just as we've done before, I'm going to open up Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to bring my exposures up just a little bit. I'm not going to go crazy with them. Bring the shadows up a little bit too. As long as my highlights are controlled and the image is a bit brighter, it'll be fine. Then I can press OK. And we can zoom into this area. And there's before and after. So look at the window down here, before and after. See, we've brightened that up beautifully. And then the arm of the chair here is much darker, and now it's brighter. So again, we've created a lovely smooth transition between those two exposures, and we've still kept that fantastic information in the exterior part of the image. Now, what about brightening up our scene? Well, before I match the base exposure, I'm going to keep the base exposure as it is. I'm going to select the brighter exposure. You see how it's invisible. I'm going to choose Instamask. I'm going to choose a dark swan. And when it comes to using a brighter exposure, I almost always, when I want to brighten up an entire scene, use a general mask like this. I want most things to be kind of white. We don't want the exterior to be affected. So I'm going to bring along the shadows and the midtones, maybe just the shadows actually. And then I can bring along the highlights and maybe the midtones a bit more so that most of the image is brighter. So this is a really bright mask and we're affecting most of the image. Now all I do is I select the bright exposure and press apply. And I can make both of these exposures visible. So this is before we've applied the bright exposure. So we've got quite a good blend here. And this is after. And as you can see, that looks crazy. We can always bring down the opacity a lot of the brighter exposure. And look at that. That looks 10 times better than before. Or we can match the brighter exposure. Before I do that, let me make the brighter exposure invisible and open up Adobe Camera Raw on the base exposure and bring down the highlights. I just want to match the brighter exposure and the base exposure, and just to show you why that makes a big difference. So there's before and after. Now actually here it probably isn't that necessary. We are bringing back more detail and more contrast, which is great, but we could probably do without that. But anyway, I'm going to leave it in for good practice. So back to the bright exposure. I'm going to make this visible, and again I'm going to open up Instamask and choose ACR. And now the reason why it looks so crazy is because this exposure is just too bright. It's much brighter than the base exposure, so naturally they can't fit together very well. So let's bring down the exposure significantly of this bright exposure. Maybe bring down the highlights a bit. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make our brighter exposure almost the perfect brightness for our final image, because we want a nice bright image. So I'm going to bring that down, the exposure, and I'm going to bring up the shadows. And so there we've got a pretty good scene, I'd say. If you're happy with that, just press OK. And look at the difference we've made there. This is before those changes and after, before and after. And this is before blending and after blending. So we've brought through that brighter exposure and it's kept all that fantastic contrast that belongs in the image. Now, of course, you would continue with your workflow, adding contrast here and there, but just blending these three exposures here has given us a great base to start working with for adding contrast and color and coming out with a great final image. So once again, we see the importance of matching our exposures to come out with a great final image. And one more thing, I'm actually just going to bring this brighter exposure down a little bit. I think the room's a little bit too bright. We want to keep those shadows, make it look quite natural. So I hope all of these examples has reinforced in you the importance of matching our exposure values and our shadows and highlights between our exposures. So it's very simple to remember this. Base exposure, bring down the highlights if necessary. Darker exposure, try to match the general brightness of the image with the base exposure, but you don't have to go too extreme. And with the bright exposure, bring down the exposure and control the shadows so that the image isn't too bright. And when you do that, you'll always come out with a much more natural final result. And you shouldn't have any added noise or image degradation in your final image.